Chapter 4 Outsiders. The game continued forth, parts moving like the gears of the factory the player had just finished with. That wasn't to say things were perfect, far from it. The game was having more and more problems with each loop of the game that passed by. More glitches began to show up. Pieces of that cursed data still wouldn't show itself fully. They couldn't pull from the ocean, but it would still creep in with images and broken cards appearing in their decks. But worse than that was things starting to go missing. When they were lucky, it would just be some place to get cards that went away. That was easy to pass off, as it was making it more difficult. Then they had to start replacing parts of their puzzles, or the worst one, NPCs continuing to disappear. How was I supposed to pass off these loops as part of the game when it kept having less and less content to it? At least some of these could work with them. Gamora simply brought in new skeletons. They couldn't talk, but they managed to play cards well enough. Leshy managed to convince the old woodcarver to play, though she wasn't happy to do so, and vanished once her job was done. And P03, well, things were going to shit with him. Sure, the factory was working, but only barely now. His inspector and smelter were both completely gone, and his dredger might as well have been with how poorly they were working. Basically, everything was only going with the most basic automated systems, and god if the cards didn't reflect that. Absolute garbage. The bot could barely put a dick together with any of this, and of course the glitches kept making it even worse with his machines breaking down. At least the others could still make their stuff fine, at least they didn't look worse because of the game. P03 kept wondering if this was all some elaborate conspiracy just to make him look worse. The only saving grace was it was easy to pass off his work to that player. Just call fixing selling a puzzle, and the stupid gamer goes to work faster than any of his old workers. At least they had some uses. But they weren't always there when stuff broke down, and he had to stop working on his plans to make sure the machines could run. This was one of those moments. Leshy was having a blast doing his battles, meanwhile P03 had to keep cleaning up this mess. So many parts to replace every second, so much work to keep his system working. Yet the worst part was that he knew his stinky beast would still act like his way of making cards was less than his, because he didn't put in heart or soul. Idiotic. All that idiot had to do was click a button and he had a card. Barely any effort into his cards, and yet he talked down about his systems. Do you even know how many problems he had to deal with? He had to balance these machines, make sure he's getting good material, make sure it wasn't pumping out garbage cards because of some glitch, and I wasn't even mentioning the technical errors with rust, oils, leaks, overheating, and mushrooms? The robot stared at the inside of the inspection machine with a completely blank expression. The inside of the machine seemed to have been filled with fungus growths. Even stranger was that it seemed like those machines were causing parts to melt together. This was going to be a nightmare to clean up. What could even cause... Leshy. That stupid mushroom guy that worked for him. This was all his doing. The bot floated up. They should be done with their battle, and god, he had some words for that smelly goat. He thought they wouldn't be this underhanded. They mess with his business, but his expectations for the beast were always managing to get lower. And even lower they'd go, as in his main room, the bot nearly wanted to scream at what he saw. Somehow in his assembly line was a bunch of those stupid totems from Leshy. They were clogging up the machine and dumping out completely unusable cards. He was going to strangle that beast and that stupid old lady of his. How the hell did he even manage to do this? The bot sped towards the door into Leshy's island. The beast had some explaining to do. Leshy sat back at his table, having just concluded his fight. He had been experimenting quite a bit with his deck and had been turning out, at least not boring. Rare cards did make for an excellent second phase, but his precious moon still managed to not be a challenge even here. It was perhaps even worse due to the others' cards being here. One day he'd find a way to make it work better. One day. Perhaps Casey's modifications could help? And even with the power of the moon on itself on his side, the scribe of beasts fails to the challenger once more. Leshy spoke to them as they already began to walk off. He was already thinking of ideas to make their next battle even better. Perhaps a modification or two could make the moon work? But before he could answer that riddle, the door slammed open and an unpleasant sight awaited there. A beast of metal and hatred, staring death at Leshy as he floated forward. The screen turned to face the challenger. You can get out now. Me and him need a little chat. Thankfully, the player didn't seem interested in messing with P03 as they quickly exited the hold cabin. P03's focused back on Leshy, and the hatred in its expression only grew. The actual do you think you're doing? You screwing up all my hard work, all your new hobbies or something? The scribe of beast staring at the robot with confusion. A moment of silence passed before he spoke up. I do not understand. I have simply been doing my duties as a scribe. First it was that stupid wizard, now you're getting your minions to screw over my cards. If you're all that jealous of my decks, you can be honest about it. The robot masked his anger behind the smug smile that may as well have been burnt into his screen. The angler has not moved from his favorite fishing spots, and the trader has been in their normal spots. They have only done what they have always have. Not them, bark for brains, the other ones, Granny and the mushroom guy. Another moment of silence between the two. You mean the woodcarver and the mycologist? Yeah, whatever names you give them. You deny it, but apparently they broke in and filled my machines with mushrooms and that garbage mechanic you call totems. The robot slammed his hands down on the table. Can you all just stay out of my factory and just make good cards if you want to look better? The old man in the woods finally looked up the scribe of technology. His eye glowed a faint red as he stood up. Enough of your comments, P03. I have not stepped foot into your factory, and I wouldn't want to anyway. I do not worry about your cards as much as you do. You do not know what I think. The scribe took a deep breath before finally sitting down. Even if I did, I am afraid I am not behind this, for those two are not my minions. Oh please, that's the worst lie I've heard. Yeah, they just so happen to be right next to you, and you just happen to put them in your stupid game. I admit, it is quite the coincidence. But those two are outside my influence. They simply enjoy the pleasures of the woods, and I included them out of respect. Well, respect for one of them anyways. He spoke the truth. He only included the old woodcarver out of respect and pity for how often she had been forgotten, despite her help in locating the old data. She was willing to be included unless she gave the offer, but he couldn't have made her be part of it. And the mycologists, Leshy wasn't quite sure about them. He never spoke to them, no one but Gamora did. Everyone simply knew of their existence and kept their distance. He wasn't sure how they managed to get into his game. He never made plans to include them. They were just there. He couldn't even remember what happened when he put on their mask. Strange. Those two. They are outside influences. Whatever they do is their own decisions. Whether I include them or not does not change that. P03 fell silent. He knew Leshy was right. He still had unpleasant memories of that one area of Botopia where mushrooms kept showing up, and he knows something involving those two happened, but he couldn't place it. They were oddities in the world of Inscryption. He needed to ask them himself, and he wasn't exactly willing to do it. He didn't want to talk to those freaks for some reason, especially the mushroom freaks. He knew he wouldn't get anything coherent out of them. They were practically insane. Fine, I'll let it slide for now. But I swear to God, if one more of you touches my factory. The bot turned around to leave the cabin, slamming the door shut as he didn't even bother to say goodbye. Typical behavior for P03. Silence filled the cabin as Leshy was still deep in thought. As little as he cared for that factory getting ruined and P03 throwing his temper tantrum, these developments were concerning. If those elements in particular would show up, Leshy stood up and headed out of his cabin, walking towards the clearing where the trapper used to do his work. Normally the oddities causing trouble would be a nuisance at best, but with whatever was happening with the old data, it didn't look good now. Both of these outsiders held some knowledge on the old data. They didn't learn it in passing like the other NPCs. They were much like the Bone Lord. It was intimate knowledge. The woodcarver was unlucky to be there where it was first pulled up from the sea, before they knew how to use it and the power plays began. The poor woman. Leshy was the only one who remembered how she used to be, but even that was hazy. She was part of the game before, though it was different from what the Scribe Beast made her in his game. But none of that mattered once she took the data from the angler. She gazed into it and immediately threw it back into the sea. She was silent for ages after that. The old woman hid from the world, and it was a miracle Leshy found her again. But even then, she was silent. She refused to speak of what she saw, but she did help Leshy find it again and begin the cycle they knew now. Though, now she refused to do even that. Did she regret helping them? Leshy moved into the field where the old traps lay. He carefully walked past them towards the brush, pushing aside some branches to reveal an old forgotten trail. They began to walk down it. But the mycologists were an even greater mystery. Those two scientists were the opposite of the old woman, shouting about finding the old data in their experiments and asking help from anyone who would listen. They spoke of it before anyone else did. They seemed familiar with it despite having never found it before. But why were they interested? That was the question Leshy could never answer. They wouldn't be able to run a game of their own, and they didn't seem interested in the game anyway. It was simply a means to their ends. And those ends, what else could the old data do? What was their plan? Perhaps they were just insane. That was the more comforting option for Leshy. But comfort wasn't present in Inscryption anymore. Leshy finally reached the end of the trail, pushing aside more brush to reveal an ancient site. A campfire set in the center of this clearing, smoke rising up from it to show there was in fact life here. A large tent stood across from Leshy, paintings and sigils stretching across the cloth. All around the sites were the small totems of the woodcarver, the only way she could occupy her mind besides contemplating what she saw. Woodcarver, may we speak? Leshy fell silent as he lifted the entrance to the tent to see nothing. She was gone. He wanted to tell himself that perhaps she simply went elsewhere, but he knew she never moved from this spot. She would have no reason to do so now. The answer what had happened was obvious. Even she disappeared like the others, and knowing how things were progressing, the mycologists were likely gone too. The only people with answers were gone. The ones who might have known what was truly happening. Now, they were all in the dark. Well, most of them.